Here I am in the empty Visual Studio or SQL Server Data Tools environment. So I'm going to create a new project. So I'll come here, File, New, Project. And because I have the BI extensions to the SQL Server Data Tools installed, then I have these templates for BI, Business Intelligence. I want to select Integration Services. And in this case, I want to select the Integration Services project. There's also one here that provides a wizard. But in this case, I want to create it from scratch. So I'll go here, and I'll give it the name AdventureWorks Export. And I can put it wherever I want. C samples is as good a location as any. And I'll click on OK, and that will create that project for me. And as you can see, when you create a new Integration Services project, you get this nice little Getting Started pane. And so if you need more information about Integration Services, you can click on the different links and go to documentation that Microsoft provides. So I'll just get that out of the way for now. All right, so the first thing I want to do is come over here to Solution Explorer and right-click on the package and rename it, because I get the default name of just package. And I want to call that Export. So I might want to give it something more meaningful, export contacts or export customers or export products or whatever, but export is fine. Just the idea is that we're changing it from that default package name. Now, one word of caution. I haven't found this so much with SQL Server 2012 integration services, but every so often data tools will prevent you from renaming a package right after you create it, because some process has a hold on the file. So most of the time you can just try it again right away and successfully change the name. But if that doesn't work, close the package, change the name, and reopen it within the designer. Also, make sure you don't accidentally delete the DTSX extension or change it to something else. Data tools will warn you if you do, but if you ignore the warning, the file will likely become unusable again until you rename it. All right, the next thing I want to do is create a shared connection manager. So I'll come over here to Solution Explorer, right-click on Connection Managers, and select New Connection Manager. And there you can see all of the different kinds of connection managers that you can create. Keep in mind that this is for both sources and destinations, because at this point, the project doesn't know what kind of a connection I'm going to create here. But in this case, I want to make a connection to SQL Server, so I'll select this OLEDB Connection Manager. And then I'll click on the Add button, which opens up this Configure OLEDB Connection Manager. And I click on the New button. And that in turn opens up this Connection Manager. Now this overall dialog box should probably look fairly familiar to you because it's just gathering the information that it needs in order to create a connection string to a SQL Server. Actually to any OLEDB database, but it's using the SQL Server native client. So I'm going to go against my local server. So I'll just use the local there. I can use the machine name, or I can access remote machines as well. Again, I can use the Windows authentication because I'm a sysadmin within the database. And then I can select the database that I want to use. And in this case, I'm going to read the data from the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database. And I can test the connection just to make sure everything's working and that I in fact do have permissions to access that database. Everything's fine. And I'll click on OK. And that saves the detail of that data connection and comes back here to the Configure OLEDB Connection Manager dialog box. As you can see with that new connection highlighted, you can see the basic information about that connection. And I can also create new data connections if I want to and so forth. That's all I need here though, is I'll click on OK and I can verify that that new connection manager appears here within Solution Explorer. And if I expand this out a bit, you can see that the name is the name of the machine instance, local, AdventureWorks LT 2012, and then it has this file extension of CONMGR for Connection Manager. All right, so with that, it's time to start creating the control flow. So what I want to do is come over here to the SSIS toolbox and grab this data flow task and drag it over to the design surface. And that creates it for me and puts it where I drop it. In fact, by the way, you might notice that kind of jumping around kind of thing. That seems to occur in all versions of Windows that I run integration services on, different versions of Visual Studio, the SQL Server data tools itself, and so forth. Just seems to be a user interface bug within the designer there. In fact, if I try to expand it or change the size, you can see that going on as well. So don't be worried about it. It doesn't seem to affect the operation or the design of integration services. And by the way, I also could have just come over here to the toolbox and double-clicked on the data flow task as well. And that would have added it in the upper left-hand corner of the control flow. All right, so I'm going to right-click on this and select Rename. And I'm just going to call this Export Contacts. Okay. So as you see, when you add a new component to a designer, Integration Services gives it a default name. The designer actually does. But I can change that. And you'll want to change that because you really want to make the package easy to maintain, whether it's you coming back 6 months from now or somebody else needing to come in. Give meaningful names to the components. All right, so that creates our control flow. So I'm going to double click on this, and that takes over to the data flow, and the selected data flow task is Export Contacts. Of course, that's the only one that's in the package at the moment. So I'm once again going to go over here to the SSIS toolbox, and I'm going to double-click the source assistant because we need to create a data source. So in this case, the source is SQL Server. So that's the default. It happens to be the first one on the list. Probably the one you're going to use most often since this is, after all, SQL Server. And then you can select an existing connection manager. So it's selecting that, or it's listed here because I created that as a project level connection manager. Or if I hadn't created it yet, I could also create a new one that'll create a package level connection manager. And this gives a summary of the connection information so I can make sure that I'm selecting the correct one. Okay, so I'll click OK, come back over, and now you can see that this package is using a project level connection manager with the name Local AdventureWorks LT 2012. And by the way, you can change that name if you want to, but it's handy to have it the same name as the database. Now, notice here on that OLEDB source that was created, there's this red X. Red is never a good thing. I can hover over that, and it says a destination table name has not been provided. So the next thing we need to do is rectify that problem. In other words, we've added this OLEDB data source. It's pointing at, it has connection information, but I haven't done anything to tell it where to grab that information. But, you know, if I come back over here again, come back off and it appears again, a destination table name has not been provided. Well, that's kind of a weird message because this is a data source. Shouldn't it be a source table? Well, it's misleading, and you could even consider it wrong. You actually need to specify the table where the data is going to be read from, or a query or whatever. Except that you have the option of reading from a table or executing a query or stored procedure. So there's more to be done to configure the component, but it's not exactly what the message indicates. So don't stress over it. There's something wrong. You need to configure the component. All right, so I'm going to double click on the component, and that opens up this OLEDB source editor. So I first want to verify that it references the connection manager that I want. Okay, that looks good. And then it gives me the option of the data access mode, a table or view, a table name or view name variable, a SQL command, or a SQL command from variables. So you can use variables to specify the data access mode, or the information used to access the data. So in this particular case, I'm going to select SQL command, and notice that this changes because I'm going to provide a SQL query in order to get the data. Because in this particular case, I don't want to return all of the columns from the table. That'd just be wasteful because I'm not going to use them. So I'm only going to use some of them. Now I have options here. I can select the box there and just start typing, or I can click on Browse Query, or if I have the SQL query within a file, I can browse that file and it'll import the text into the text box. Okay, but I'm just going to go ahead and type in the command. It's not all that complex. First name, middle name, last name, company name, email address, and phone from sales LT customer. Okay, so fairly easy query to type in. I can parse the query just to make sure that I haven't done any syntax kind of errors. That doesn't verify it against the database, but it's valid transact SQL. And then I can come down here and click on Preview and make sure that this is going to extract the information that I wanted. Okay, so I have first name, last name. Yeah, it looks like I have all the information, phone and so forth. Okay, and notice that it only displays the first 200 rows, so it's not going to return all 300 million rows on a remote server if that's how many rows are there. But just enough to give you an idea that this is the correct information that you want to return. This is particularly useful if you are writing a transact SQL statement that executes a join with multiple tables. Then it's real handy to be able to look at that and verify that you have the right query going on. Okay, so that's the query. And there's various other things that you can use to configure this, but that's good enough for now. And notice that the red X is gone. So that component, at least as far as we know now before we execute the package, that is now configured at least with the minimum information that integration services needs. All right, so the next thing I want to do is come back over here to the toolbox, and I want to create a destination for that data. So I'll come down here to Other Destinations, and I want a flat file destination, and I'll drag it over and drop it right there, and I'll move it over a little bit closer. Well, I'll try to anyway. Sometimes that jumps around a little bit much, a little bit unnerving, but anyway. Now, almost always the first thing I want to do when I add a new data flow component is select what is going to be the previous or the preceding operation and create this link to it. So I'm going to drag this blue line over to that component. Because what that's going to do is that's going to read the output of this component, which again is going to be those fields in the query that I defined, and that's going to form the import into this flat file destination. That's one of the configuration things I need to do, but it's important because now this component knows what kind of data it's going to be getting, what columns, and some metadata about the types of fields and so forth. All right, but we still have a red X because this component is not done. So a connection manager has not been assigned to the flat file destination connections, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we haven't said anything about where this information is going to go to. So I'll double click on this component in order to configure that. And now I need to create a new flat file connection manager. So I'll click on New there. And I'll select Limited, but I could also make it fixed width or fixed width with row delimiters and ragged right and so forth. So this is some options on how I create that flat file. But I'm going to accept the default, which is just a regular delimited file. And then it opens up this Flat File Configuration Manager Editor dialog box. So the first thing I want to do is give this a meaningful name, and I'm going to call it Contacts for Export. And I could give it a description if I wanted to. I won't in this particular case. And I'll browse here. Once again, go to C, Learn Now SSIS, and I'll go here to SSIS. And I'll create a file called Contacts. And click on OK, and that creates that path for me. I do want to include the column names in the first data row, so I'll select that option right there. And then I can change the locale and the code page and the format, text qualifier, and all that, but I'll leave those defaults. But the important thing here is that you have some flexibility in how that file is going to be created. The important thing here too is that this Flat File Connection Manager Editor is used for defining flat files both as sources and destinations of data. So a lot of the settings in the various pages here are appropriate only when it's used as a source. So those don't apply in this case where it's used as a destination. All right, so I'll click on OK and go back here to the flat file destination editor. And now I'm going to click on the mappings, and so you can see how the input fields are mapped to the output fields, the source to the destination. So this is where it was important to make that connection between the data source and the destination, because by hooking up the source, this original OLEDB data source here, that provided that list of fields that were coming into the flat file destination. And then by default, it gives the output fields the same name as the input fields, but you can change that. I'm not going to do that, so I'm just going to click on OK, and now we've finished configuring that flat file destination. And I'll go ahead and save that package.